Well, we lived in Portugal at the time, and my father was an engineer, and he was stationed in Lisbon. And the mother became interested in ceramics, and she imported an electric kiln from Britain. And then she hired a local potter to come and throw pots for her so she could decorate them. And I became sort of interested in that, and she had a little studio. So I started playing around in her studio. And we would visit some of the local earthenware factories in the area. They were sort of small-scale family operations. And I became very interested in the technical processes of making pots. 10, 11, 12, that sort of age. Yeah. And it's interesting that one's early experiences have a huge effect on your later life. So it never occurred to me that I'd ever become a potter. And so when I went to university, I studied originally engineering, and then I switched into agriculture. So I have a degree in agriculture. So it was much later on in life that I worked for Shell Canada as a chemist, and hated it, and ultimately returned to that childhood interest of working with clay. So I was transferred from Vancouver to Winnipeg with Shell Oil, and I started studying at the art school in Winnipeg, and learned how to throw. And when I was confident enough that I could throw pots, I quit. I had intended to re-educate myself by going back to university, and I actually was accepted into University of California, the Berkeley campus. But then I was dissuaded from doing that by a fellow artist who said to me, why do you need more education when what you really want to do is make pots? And I said, well, that's good advice. So I scratched all that idea and came straight back to Vancouver. Studied for a year at the Vancouver School of Art, the old Vancouver School of Art. But then I ended that rather quickly, feeling that I was wasting my time. I was arrogant and youthful. Wanted to get on with it. So then I built a studio and worked as a production potter for about 7 years. And then I was getting rather worn out, having to produce huge numbers of pots and earning a very minimal living. I was in my 30s. Yeah. For a while, I was making stuff for an organization called Danica Imports. They would buy a monthly quota from me and ship it across the country. So I literally turned myself into a machine, which I hated. And I finally said to them, I can't do this anymore. And then I was approached by the old Vancouver School of Art as a possible substitute teacher. And so I did that, and that ultimately became a full-time profession. So I was taught at Emily Carr for, 20 years or so. And of course that relieved the financial pressure. Because when I was a full-time potter, I was earning about $3,000 a year. That was all. And I was able to survive, partly because I'd bought some really cheap real estate. So my mortgage payment was $50 a month, I think. Teaching an art school, of course, got me involved with a much wider, much broader scene. And so I had to teach myself a lot more about the history of ceramics, also the history of art. And as a result of that, my work began to change. So I slowly moved away from making functional pots into making one-of-a-kind pieces. Right? And lately I've become very interested in the painter's world. Well, I was very aware of that art-craft difference when I was teaching at Emily Carr, because we were seen as a craft area and were considered less important, I think. But I was fairly happy with that because they left us alone. We could do our own thing, you know. There wasn't quite the same pressure. But I think it's changed a lot these days. I mean, a lot of artists have become interested in clay. And so that art-craft division, I think, is broken down quite a bit. When I had that show at the Burnaby Art Gallery, and the catalogue that Carol made, I made the conscious decision that I was going to lower my firing temperature and I was going to use color, which is a big change because before I was working in high fire reduction pots and all the colors were subdued, you know, subtle. And all of a sudden I launched into very strong color. And I started looking at Rothko, the painter, and did a whole series of pieces that were strongly influenced by his work. But I have to admit, I'm a bit of a butterfly. I move quite often, and I'm strongly influenced, of course, by other artists. And on the statement about this show, I acknowledge that fact. And there's some pieces that will be in the show that are very strongly influenced by Albert's. You can see it, right? Well, that piece on the wall over there, it looks like a direct steal. Hopefully I've added something new to it, but I do borrow a lot of ideas from other artists and hope that I can then add some sort of new content. Well, it's partly, I suppose, because I'm finding it a little easier to work in the flat as opposed to creating sculptures, which are full of all kinds of problems in ceramics. As soon as you increase the scale in ceramics, you run into all kinds of technical difficulties. Things crack, they warp, they change. And so it's a bit of a relief, actually, for me to limit myself to two-dimensional work for a change. I didn't know much about color, and what, of course, is incredibly important is what color you put next to another color. Well, a painter knows that, obviously. Well, I didn't know much about that. So it was a real discovery for me to realize that you can make a color far more vibrant if you put a different color beside it, as long as it's the right color and the right contrast. So I find that exploration very interesting. Yeah, I generally draw. I have an idea, I'll generally try and draw it out. And I do all kinds of variations of the idea before I actually start in the studio. And then as I actually create the piece, I'm referencing the drawing, but in the making, things change. Yeah, and so the end piece is never quite the same as the drawing, because I make discoveries as I go along. Yeah. But I do find it helpful to have a drawing to begin with. And sometimes I'll make a drawing full scale, the same scale as the piece, because that gives me a much stronger idea of how it might look. Yeah. And of course, I enjoyed my teaching years also very much. And it was a very good learning experience for me. I learned as much from my students as I was able to give them myself, I think. So for a while, I was doing these still life compositions, such as the ones you see behind. And as that was the result of setting a project for my students when I was still teaching, which was to create a still life in 3 dimensions. And I became so interested in that as a project that I gave myself the same project. So I seem to be over that period, but I tend to continually move forward, I think, yeah. I've worked really quite hard for the past year, actually. And I started out really by making some sculptures. Some of those will be included. But then I moved into more two-dimensional work. And I'm quite influenced by the minimalists, people like Ellsworth Kelly, and I have some pieces that will be in the show that are very reminiscent of Kelly. So I've borrowed some of his minimalist ideas. There's another artist I'm interested in is the Carmen Herrera, who is actually a Cuban artist. Another artist that influenced me quite strongly was Hilma af Klint. And somehow the geometry of some of her painting really appealed to me. So that got me off onto a whole series of geometric kind of experiments. And I enjoy the sense of organization and serenity from a geometric image.
I see.
That seems to suit my personality because I tend to be a bit tight-assed.
Oh, I thought the other way around.
No.
You're very relaxed.
Well, but the work is not so relaxed, it's very controlled. And so a lot of the pieces in the show are highly controlled, they're not loose at all. But what seems to boil down to is a real interest in the organization of a geometric image.
I see.
And impressing different colored grogs into the surface to give more texture.
I see.
And that's something that I think I might continue to work on for a while. I'd like to increase my range of colored grogs. And I make those myself by grinding up materials and into a fine sand. Yeah. Well, pottery is very unthreatening. People understand pots, and so it's appealing to a much wider audience. They're not intimidated by pots.
Oh, I see.
Whereas they are often by fine art, particularly if it's highly intellectual work. So in that sense, pottery is far more accessible, I think. But then you see, I've moved away from pots, and I've lost that audience, really.
Right.
Yes, I spend long hours alone in the studio, but I don't feel solitary, really. I mean, Rosalind is very aware of where I am, what I'm doing, and I'm often come and ask her opinions about things. So I'm not totally alone at all. Yeah, I welcome critical input. I really like that. And the trouble is, it's very hard to get good critical input. Most people are nice, they're polite. And I'm sure during this show, people will come and they'll say nice things. I'm actually more interested in the bad things that they have to say.
I see.
I find that a lot more interesting. So I'm not really wanting compliments. What I would like is criticism. Because that makes me think a bit about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and where I might go. And of course, I always have the option of either accepting the criticism or rejecting it, saying, well, I don't agree.
Sure, of course, yes, I see.
But I really like that kind of dialogue where there's a critical input. So I could see being criticized by being so highly eclectic, Well, I think it depends a lot on the attitude of the viewer. And of course, the question I often ask myself is, since I'm moving into two dimensions, why don't I just paint? Because some of the pieces in the show could probably have been done on plywood or canvas. That'd be different, obviously. But I seem to prefer the safety of staying within my own medium. Having reached the right old age of 88, I'm not sure how much longer I can continue. But I don't want to just peter out, you see. I'd rather just stop. I watched my mother do that. She was very interested in painting. And she had a few years where she was very active, and then slowly she petered out. Painting became less interesting, and finally she gave up. I would rather just stop.
Really? Wow.
And move into music, say. Because I like music. I believe it or not, I have an accordion that I like to play. Yeah. So, so you never know. I might switch. I might say, okay, done that, been there. I am now going to become an accordionist. I wish that actually I had enough skill on the accordion that I could be playing.
Oh, right. That's the next one. Next
maybe.
video.
Yeah.